Okay, think of the parable of the 5 blind men, the famous Hindu parable, and the elephant. Think of the elephant as some symbol. It could be a symbol of the self. Jungians often interpret it that way. For the Hindus, it would be a symbol of Brahman, of the field of knowledge, perhaps we could think of it. Some huge area which we blindly touch some part of and try and figure out what it is. It's a useful parable because, as we know, from psychology and from philosophy, the world of our consciousness is in some sense blind. It only has limited access to the real, so-called real world, doesn't it? It's a limited antenna. Even our senses are limited, and our senses are major feeders for the brain. And so therefore, the idea that somehow we're touching different parts of a vast field is a parable that's made sense across the ages. We will think of the fields of knowledge that are in front of us, as I was going over half a dozen or a dozen of them in the last week or two. I tried to think of what it felt like to be looking at these fields of knowledge like history and economics and physics and chemistry and life sciences and systems theory, and the list went on, the things we've looked at. And indeed, many of these things are covered in that wonderful book, Systems View of Life by Capra, which covers so many disciplines. It's just amazing what he's done. And it seemed to me they were like fractals or kaleidoscopes and some changing multiplicitous system, and which somehow just went on forever. And indeed, that is how I phrased it in The Sower and the Seed in the opening chapter, where so it's only 4 or 5 paragraphs opening chapter, and the last paragraph basically is about some telescope, which is our consciousness, pointed to the starry sky, to a universe which is always expanding beyond our range. So this is like also a symbol for our knowledge system, our consciousness, which is looking at an expanding world of knowledge, an expanding universe, which is indeed not just expanding but accelerating, isn't it? But that's like knowledge. Knowledge is accelerating, and it's infinite. It's not that we're going to find the ultimate theory of everything. These are nice words to hear and sell a lot of books, but in fact, all we come up against is an edge of more mystery. And if you think of physics, that's been totally the case. The astounding discoveries of physics, but then come up against the enormous mystery of string theory and black holes and so on. We've just gone into other universes and other dimensions and other cosmi and forces that we scarcely can comprehend. And that's been the result of 150 years of advanced physics making tremendous progress. So it seems as if our telescope, our consciousness, looks out into the cosmos to something which is always expanding ultimately beyond us, no matter what advances we make. And that we always see some reflection somehow of ourselves, that consciousness is seeing itself. We're looking at the Big Bang, or we're looking at the supposed Big Bang, or we're looking at the origins of things. We push back to the origins, but ultimately consciousness is looking at itself, or looking at its creator, or looking at some vast intelligence which it is part of or co-creationist with. And so therefore it requires not just knowledge and seeing things outside of one, but looking inside of one and uniting the contemplative disciplines, the inner knowledge, with what is going on outside in terms of our knowledge systems. To get some quick hold upon these knowledge systems, you might think of them as being powered or fueled by various methods. The first method, of course, is the scientific method, which has been around since the Western Enlightenment. Enlightenment is a double-edged word. In the West, it means the scientific enlightenment of knowledge beginning with the 16th, 17th century. And in the East, of course, enlightenment is an inner state of vast intuition and integration, and is ultimately a spiritual state. So very different views of enlightenment. The scientific method which emerged from the Western Enlightenment is a certain set of principles, philosophy, which underlies all of the knowledge virtually that has been gained. That is, it uses the scientific method. I'll just call that SM, scientific method, by which things are looked at objectively, they're broken down analytically, hypotheses are made, inductions are made as opposed to deductions, so it's an inductive logic. Inductive means that you draw from the evidence in front of you the induction, the hypothesis that you want to test. Deduction means that you have a certain knowledge system in your head and you deduce from that the hypothesis that should result from, it could be a dogma, it could be a religion, it could be just simply a paradigm that you believe exists, and therefore you make a deduction from it. But genuine science is inductive. It's willing to change its principles, it's willing to change its paradigms, as indeed we see in modern physics. Modern physics is inductive, isn't it? It's willing to change its view of the universe, the cosmos, and the role of the observer. The very nature of science changes under the impact of the new knowledge which is discovered in physics, like subatomic particles, the unity of the observer with what is being observed, the subquantum world, subatomic world, the so-called quantum reality. So physics has changed, and this scientific method is a paradigm, of course, the queen of the sciences. Behind that, you can think of the modern worldview, which I refer to as MWV later on, and the modern worldview is basically a wider set of philosophical principles which underpins the scientific method. And the modern worldview states that the human consciousness is the height of evolution. It is evolved by accident. The universe is essentially dead and has produced life by accident, by random mutation. Life has developed, and the right of human consciousness and its center point, the ego, is to dominate this world and to have mastery over it and to use it as it sees fit. It's a very exploitative, it's a very dominating view, the modern worldview. The alternate worldview we can see emerging in the new metaphysics, and that was really informing the reference I sent you, Mind Before Matter, that book, and I gave you a small summary of it, and in which there are various authors, including Anne Baring actually. And the alternative worldview is very different. It states a different set of principles, which we'll look at in a moment, but essentially they are at the opposite end of the spectrum from the modern worldview. And another simple philosophical guiding point through this system of knowledge is the first year philosophy course where the student learns about various things, including idealism and materialism. Remember, I learned that in my first term of philosophy. And idealism is when you view the world or you view the mind, consciousness as an ideal, as it's been produced by a god or produced by some intelligence, which is non-material. So it's an ideal, idealistic, is the word we get from it, but idealism. Hegel, for example, is usually classified as an idealist. That is, he looks at history and says that there's some spirit running throughout history, isn't there? Materialism is a view which says, well, no, the opposite is the case, that material values, material forces, analytic intelligence, dead matter, which has to be understood in terms of its forces, its physics, or indeed in social terms, in terms of class struggle, material factors which can be looked at as concrete relationships in human beings, or concrete material things in the world, constitute the view of materialism. The fields that we could look at and say, well, how are these fields of knowledge doing in the 21st century in terms of these simple ideas which we put forward, like idealism and materialism? Are they idealistic or materialistic? Is there a movement in these fields towards the alternative worldview, which tends to be more spiritual, more process-orientated, more systems-orientated, sees things as a whole, sees human beings as part of that whole? Or are they dominated by the materialist worldview and the scientific method, which tend to be more analytic and materialist? Where in that spectrum do they lie? Yep. And if we're looking at half a dozen or so of these fields of knowledge, and I made some, as it were, quick judgments on them. I had to say that the materialist worldview has dominated not only the 18th and 19th century, but also the 20th and 21st century, and is likely to continue. That no matter what discipline you go into, that the materialist worldview and the scientific method is the dominant one. It's the one that's taught in universities, it's the one that's taught in institutions across the world, and even in those fields where you think most need some alternative worldview, like economics, a field I know quite well. Well, you know, no matter what crisis we've gone through, the 2008 crisis, the ecological crisis, economics courses are still taught across the world broadly in the same way. They're still taught in the same principles as they were 40, 50, 100 years ago. It's amazing. And then when I was a teacher, I tried to introduce a course on crisis economics and economics of ecology. And basically it was just voted out, and no, we need macroeconomics, we need microeconomics, we need business economics. This is what students are looking for, and these alternative things are not relevant. You know, blind man touching the elephant. No view of, you know, even the wider field around one. It's just simply, this is our field, and this is what advances our field. And really what you're talking about is just airy-fairy nonsense. So this is, even in those fields which need it most, I think my honest assessment is that the materialist worldview is totally dominant, not very dominant, and only one or two fields have incorporated alternative worldviews to some extent. Strange enough, the queen of the science, above all, precisely where the great destroyer has, physics being the great destroyer of religion, right? And life sciences, the great destroyers of religion. These have been the fields that have actually surprised us the most. Well, particularly physics, because in the world of physics, we have come out with this different reality, the subatomic field, and the field of relativity theory has shown us that really our conscious dimension is only the middle sphere. It's what the human beings believe to be their reality. But it doesn't correspond to the reality that surrounds us or is above us in the macro field of relativity theory, or in the subatomic field, in the microfields, which constitute everything below our field of vision, so to speak. So this has been the most surprising. And string theory has been now around, does it belong in the materialist worldview or the alternative view? It's been around since the 1970s. Holographic analysis has been around since the 1980s. So string theory has actually come out with these amazing ideas that there's actually infinite number of universes, as if our universe was not big enough. They have now proposed that string theory that there's infinite numbers of universe, and they find it very difficult to find evidence for it, but they still keep this up as a big theory. Holograms has been around now for some time, but it hasn't gone away, and more and more physicists are looking at string theory and becoming interested in it, and also ideas of black holes and holograms, and coming out with ideas which really belong in the world, you think of metaphysics rather than physics. Meta means above, doesn't it? So the metaphysics, the world of religion and the world of some superordinate reality, metaphysics, above the world, above physics. They seem to be like metaphysicians rather than physicists. And their ideas have totally turned our normal ideas of reality on its head. And as Capra said in 1975, in his very original first book, he said that it's very like Eastern mysticism. Mystics of the East correspond their views of so-called reality to the world of physics and quantum physics. That seems to have grown. That seems to be gaining more apace. And now physicists in the last 10 years are contemplating something that they never contemplated before. Up to 10 years ago, every physicist more or less said, mathematician, we can't look past the Big Bang, right? 13.8 billion years ago, there's a Big Bang, we can prove it, there's all this evidence, and the evidence is good. But we can't go beyond that because the laws of physics break down. You can't make any sense of it. Now, a great number of physicists, I wouldn't say the majority, but a great number think of something that preceded the Big Bang. And they're beginning to construct mathematical models, which is the only thing that makes sense to them, which give them some kind of idea of what may have led towards the Big Bang. Of course, it's not going to be a mystery to people that there must have been a big contraction before the big expansion. It's a very simple piece of mechanical logic, and indeed it's the one that I adopted in Sower and the Seed, and is in Hindu mythology. The contractions and expansions of the breath of the Brahman, of the universe, correspond to the expansion and contractions of the universes across the ages, across infinity. It's a wonderful idea. They came out with it thousands of years ago, and I think physics is edging towards that. And in string theory, they've even made this even more remarkable by suggesting that the contraction that may have existed before the current expansion, the Big Bang, was what we see in front of us regularly in terms of black holes. The black holes of the universe, which now we know right across the universe, and certainly in the centre of every galaxy, aren't they? That they swallow matter, but then what happens to it? Well, physicists, you say, we don't know what happens to it. You can't say that. It's an invalid question. Now they're suggesting that this matter, vast amounts of matter in the cosmos, are swallowed by the black holes, destroying the previous universe, and then spewing it out and creating a new universe. So our universe is a result of a black hole. We're looking at ourselves when we look back at 13.8 million years ago, taking our consciousness out to that far. We're looking at the black hole spewing out what came in before. We are that. So this got really weird, hasn't it? It's got really weird and very exciting and very interesting. And you can't help but think metaphysically at this point, can you? They've stretched the metaphysics. Even the Hindus must be amazed at this. But of course the Hindus will insist that they got there first on these things. They were thinking about these things many thousands of years ago. So physics is the grand exception. The alternative worldview has come out with some amazing things, and it's certainly worthwhile keeping up to date with the vast advances in this field. Life sciences, Darwin's theory of evolution, of course, has received increasing support, and the dominant theory in the life sciences. It's been united in the synthetic view of neo-Darwinism, the grand synthesis, with Mendel's discovery of genetics, the great Czech monk, and also with the DNA discoveries in the 50s and 60s, Crick and Watson in Britain, who basically provided the basis for understanding the structure of DNA, and the human genome was now being cracked, as well as the Neanderthal genome and lots of animals' genomes, for which the 21st century is going to be transformed by our knowledge of the genome, we think. So the life sciences look solidly in the materialist worldview, don't they? That's by materialist analysis, Darwin's theory of evolution, Mendel's theory of genetics, the Darwinian, theory of the DNA. It's all solidly materialistic, but the material world, induction, logic, hypotheses, materialistic units, even the tiny small chromosomes, below that genes. These are the determinants of the life system. Right. So it seems a triumph for the modern worldview, doesn't it? However, there's lots of problems in it. It's not quite like physics, where a new expanding alternative worldview seems possible, but there's something called facilitated evolution, which you may come across, which is that there's lots of people, Stephen Goulding is one of them, Stephen Gould I think his name is, who have proposed that the big leaps in evolution cannot be explained by this synthesis theory. That the leaps are so fast and so intricate that there's no way the gene pools could have accounted for it with their mutational changes, which, although they can be fast, are a lot slower than what is required to account for these sudden punctuated equilibria, they're called, these sudden new leaps in evolution where you suddenly move into like human consciousness, or the development of a wing suddenly comes very fast. The traditional theory of Darwin's theory is that everything develops very slowly by genetic mutation, bit by bit. It's a slow process, organised, ordered process. But increasing amounts of evidence are saying, no, evolution makes these sudden leaps. And this is more facilitated by a view of systems theory, isn't it? Systems theory, Capra, remember, and lots of others in the 20th century, but Capra seemed to sum this up, has said that you get these what's called emergent effects in the life process and in physics and in social sciences, by which you get these sudden leaps which become possible as a result of some kind of build-up which you can't see and it's below the surface, and suddenly create new forms, and they're called and these emergent effects. Okay. So there are even things in biology, things at the side where we're thinking, this sounds very like what Wallace, remember Wallace and Darwin? They discovered evolution together and they decided to publish together, but Darwin had been doing it long before and he got the prize, so to speak. But Wallace was also out in Indonesia and he was doing his research and actually got his letter to Darwin explaining natural selection before Darwin had published. So he's a brilliant young man. And he believed towards the end, in his midlife, and wrote to Darwin that he believed that the natural selection theory of Darwin was not quite sufficient to explain the great variety of evolution. And Darwin wrote back to him saying, do not abandon our method, do not abandon the scientific method. It's a materialistic method. Please have your head screwed on, you're getting carried away there in the jungles of Indonesia. Please keep your scientific head on, like Freud said to Jung. You know, don't abandon our canon, our materialistic method, and give in to superstition. So, but Wallace and Henri Bergson and so on, Ilan Vital, have all suggested that there is something else operating in evolution which is remarkable and which can't quite be explained by the modern worldview. Other fields of knowledge, the evolution of our species, you would think that the evolution of human beings, we would find lots of things that, as it were, support the alternative worldview, wouldn't you? After all, how have human beings developed their consciousness and so on? But if you look at the field of the evolution of our species, basically it's been dominated by the materialist worldview, and the alternative view of something more spiritual or something more the mystery of consciousness has largely gone unexplored in this field. It's mostly explained, according to the evolutionists, by, well, our consciousness developed as a result of random mutation. This is their usual answer. There were genetic random mutations between the Neanderthals and us. So basically, it's still dominated by the materialist worldview. Ecology is an exception, because ecology is dominated by a crisis, isn't it, the field of ecology. We have scientific ecology, dominated by the material worldview, and we have deep ecology, which says, no, there's a crisis in our world system, and that we have to be aware of our consciousness doing this to the planet. We have been responsible for this, and we are deeply immersed in our ecology. We're not separate human beings from it, from the rest of creation, from the rest of evolution, sorry. 20th century, and I expect will increase, besides systems view of life. Instead of looking at an individual component on the elephant, is trying to look at the total system. Process theory, of course, Whitehead has suggested this in the early 20th century, that you've got to look at things as processes and not as nuts and bolts and bits and pieces to be analysed and put together separately. That the whole thing is a process system and is a world of flux and change. So we do have philosophers in the 20th century who I anticipate will have increasing influence. Whitehead at the beginning of the 20th century is just one example, there's lots of others, and Capra towards at the beginning of the 21st century. Their views of process and change and being part of a larger system are all part, inevitably, of a greater view which we must incorporate, and I anticipate will increasingly challenge the materialist worldview. And indeed, we're realizing that the center of this view is the human being, and that we have lots of study of the right hand now, the left hemispheres, the right hemispheres of the brain, which show exactly this dichotomy. The left-hand side of our brain, as we now know, tends to look at things analytically, materialistically, tends to break things down. And so it's ideally suited to the modern worldview and the scientific method, isn't it? We would expect, therefore, that in those parts of the world where the modern worldview and scientific method are dominant, that there'll be a dominance of the left-hand side of the brain. People think more analytically, more logically, more rationally, more coldly, less emotionally, less intuitively, and so on. And indeed, I think that's broadly what we find if you look at our educational systems. There's only very few parts of our educational system which encourage the right hemisphere point of view. The right hemisphere is slightly more emotional, but it's certainly more intuitive, and it certainly looks at the context of things, the gestalt of things, a lot more, doesn't it? And we now know it's this balance between the right and the left hemisphere as Jung would have said, the conscious and the unconscious. It's, to my mind, a development of what Jung was talking about anyway, and depth psychology. That this unity of ourselves, which is essentially what we're looking for, this integration, is vital. And that systems view and process theory, which will gain force, and this alternative worldview will unite with the materialist worldview to provide another synthesis in the 21st century, instead of being separate and opposing camps. That's my belief. Other fields, history, economics, psychotherapy, neuroscience, I could go on, but just take two that I know something about to wrap this up. Economics has huge gaps in its systems analysis. It generally does not look at how it integrates with ecology, for example, and its destruction for the planet. It generally does not look at how human beings destroy other societies. It doesn't take account of externalities, external costs. It doesn't take account of the huge indirect costs which are caused by modern industrial systems and their impact upon nature. It doesn't count those costs. It counts things in a very narrow, analytic and materialist manner, accountancy manner. And even despite the crisis of 2008 and despite the ecology crisis that we all know is happening in front of us, the economics is the last to change in these matters, and they have a lot to answer for. Psychotherapy has also been dominated by this dichotomy between the modern and the worldview and the alternative worldview. The modern worldview, you could say, was represented by Freud, modernism, scientific method, looking at the human beings and discovering the unconscious, an amazing discovery, but then saying it's explained materialistically, really. It's explained by, for Freud, sexual and aggressive forces. Instinctual forces from the psyche are explaining what's going on. And certainly that'll take you some distance, and certainly you find some evidence for that. Of course, we come from the world of creatures and animals, and we've evolved. But Jung represents the alternative worldview, a worldview which actually believes in some unity of the psychotherapist and the client, or between mankind and nature, which looks at the scientific method, is able to use it, but at the same time moves to the realm of what I'm just going to summarize: his alchemy and his Gnosticism and all the other things, of the alternative things that he developed and pioneered and has given to us as tremendous gifts, as his as the transpersonal. Transpersonal is now a big word, but that actual word originated with Jung. The transpersonal. There's part of the human psyche which is transpersonally linked. That vision of Jung has just gained in force by those areas of psychotherapy and neuroscience and so on, which see the human being increasingly as having this dimension, not just an instinctual dimension, not just an emotional dimension, or a conscious dimension, or an unconscious explained by our instincts dimension, but higher dimensions which reach the transpersonal, in which the distinction between ourselves and the nature and ourselves and the other breaks down, just as it breaks down in physics. That distinction between ourselves and the electron or the particle breaks down as two separate entities. And the idea of entanglement and unity and this participation mystique, as we've called it, this unity with the world, becomes evident. So psychotherapy has this problem also. There's a great deal of it, like psychology, dominated by the modern worldview. Proper diagnosis, proper clinical practices, separation between client and analyst, looking at things analytically, verbally, trying to understand the source of things. It's a modern worldview, isn't it? Modern science. But then when you explore that, as I've had to, you run up against the limits of its healing capacity, of its capacity for change in the personality. You get a certain distance with that worldview. But then in the psyche, you rapidly come across parts of it which cannot be explained by the modern worldview. You have to use another set of tools. And that's why I wrote Healing Intelligence, because I began to realize that the healing that takes place and that most people are seeking can only be achieved by other methods rather than the analytical method offered by my training. You have to use something else, and you have to put yourself in there in some way, otherwise it doesn't work. And so I began to become fascinated by this healing intelligence and this mystery of what we can. I'm just going to summarize the alternative worldview. I could go on about that, of course, but I'm going to leave that and just finally end with that neuroscience. And of course, a lot of you read and were inspired by the McGilchrist, which looks at this two sides of ourselves, where we can see this division between materialism and idealism, these different worldviews, analytic versus the intuitive and the spiritual, played out in the different sides of our brain. So what we're doing in the world in terms of our consciousness is ultimately reflected in ourselves, the observer, who is looking out at the world. We and the elephant are the same. Or as the Hindu said, Brahman is ultimately Atman. Our individual souls are ultimately part of the great cosmos. We could go on, but we haven't got time. So reactions against the modern worldview, of course, all the world's religions, the perennial philosophy, the wisdom traditions. Perennial philosophy is basically, across the ages, those philosophies and cults, religions and so on, which believe there's some underlying reality underneath our phenomenal world, which is quite different from what we imagine and what we analyse. The Romantics, Blake in particular, much of classical music, Kabbalah, Gnostics, alchemy, Sufism, the rebirth of the soul, etc. all, of course, have strong reactions against the modern worldview. The status of the modern worldview, however, is that it is dominant in most disciplines. However, it will be increasingly challenged. And indeed, as the conditions underlying the modern worldview change, ecology, economics, and the crises of the 21st century, increasing numbers of people will look at the modern worldview and saying, this is precisely what has advanced us to a certain extent, but also got us into deep trouble.